June 22, 1941, German panzer commanders watched in horror as their superior 37mm anti-tank shells bounced harmlessly off a crude-looking Soviet tank, ricocheting like pebbles off a steel wall, while the T-34 systematically destroyed 3 German panzers before vanishing into the forest. Within months, this single design flaw in German thinking would cost them the entire Eastern Front, and reveal that the Soviets had secretly solved the mathematics of armored warfare that German engineers never even knew existed. But how did a nation the Nazis called technically inferior engineer a tank so revolutionary that every modern tank today still uses its core design principles? The summer sun blazed over the Eastern Front on June 22, 1941. Dust clouds rose from the dirt roads as German panzer divisions rolled deeper into Soviet territory. The air smelled of diesel fuel and hot metal. Tank engines roared across the flat plains of western Russia. German soldiers believed they would crush the Soviet Union in just a few weeks. Oberst Heinrich Müller stood tall in his command tank, watching the landscape through his field glasses. His gray uniform was crisp and clean. Iron crosses decorated his chest from victories in Poland and France. Müller had commanded tanks for 15 years. He trusted German engineering more than anything else in the world. His Panzer IV tank was a masterpiece of precision. Every bolt was perfect. Every gauge worked exactly right. The thick steel armor could stop any enemy shell. Major Klaus Weber climbed out of his own tank nearby. Sweat dripped down his face in the morning heat. He had read the intelligence reports about Soviet tanks, but he did not believe them. The reports claimed the Soviets had built something called a T-34. Weber laughed at the idea. How could primitive Russians build better tanks than German engineers? It seemed impossible. The German war machine needed resources. Hitler had promised his generals that capturing Soviet factories would fuel their war effort. Oil fields in the south would power their tanks. Grain from Ukrainian farms would feed their soldiers. Industrial cities would make weapons for Germany. Everything depended on quick victory. German tank design followed strict rules. Armor plates stood straight up and down. This made the steel thick and strong. Tank crews could see clearly through small viewing ports. Every part was made with perfect German precision. Mechanics needed special tools and training to fix these complex machines, but they were beautiful and powerful. On the Soviet side, Sergeant Ivan Petrov sat inside his T-34 tank with his crew. The inside was cramped and noisy. Paint peeled from the walls. Tools rattled in metal boxes. But Petrov knew something the Germans did not know. His tank looked simple on the outside, but Soviet engineers had discovered something amazing about armor. The morning attack began like all the others. German tanks moved forward in perfect formation. Their guns pointed straight ahead. Radio voices crackled with confident commands. Müller expected to crush any resistance within hours. Soviet forces always ran away or surrendered quickly. Then something strange happened near the town of Smolensk. A lone Soviet tank appeared on a small hill. It looked different from anything the Germans had seen before. The armor slanted backward at odd angles. The turret was round and smooth. It moved faster than expected across the rough ground. Weber ordered his gunner to fire. The 37mm shell flew straight at the Soviet tank. Everyone expected to see it explode in flames. Instead, the shell hit the slanted armor and bounced away like a rubber ball. It whistled over the heads of surprised German infantry. The Soviet tank kept moving. Müller could not believe his eyes. He grabbed his radio and shouted orders to his other tanks. 3 more German shells hit the mysterious tank. All 3 bounced away without causing damage. The slanted armor somehow deflected every shot. The Soviet tank turned its turret toward the Germans. Its 76mm gun was much bigger than the German guns. The first shot hit Weber's tank and punched straight through the armor. The explosion killed Weber instantly. Black smoke poured from the wreckage. Panic spread through the German formation. Their perfect tanks could not hurt this strange enemy, but it could destroy them easily. The Soviet tank moved from position to position. Its wide tracks gripped the mud better than narrow German tracks. 2 more German tanks exploded in balls of fire. Petrov and his crew worked like a machine inside their T-34. The tank was designed for exactly this kind of fighting. Every part was simple and strong. When something broke, they could fix it with basic tools. The thick, slanted armor protected them from enemy fire. Their powerful gun could destroy any German tank. The German survivors retreated in confusion. Muller stared at the burning wrecks of his unit. 3 of his best tanks were gone. The crews were dead. All because of one Soviet tank that should not have existed. His hands shook as he tried to understand what had happened. Back at German headquarters, officers studied the battle reports. They could not explain how their superior technology had failed so badly. Some suggested the reports were wrong. Others blamed bad luck or poor training. Nobody wanted to admit that Soviet engineers might have built something better than German machines. But the evidence was clear. German shells bounced off Soviet armor like stones off a wall. German tanks burned while the T-34 drove away undamaged. The mathematics of slanted armor had defeated German engineering pride. The angle of the armor made it twice as thick against incoming shells. Simple physics had outsmarted complex German technology. Word of the encounter spread through the German ranks like wildfire. Tank crews whispered about the mysterious Soviet tank that could not be killed. Fear replaced confidence. The easy victory Hitler had promised was turning into something much more dangerous. Muller spent that night staring at the stars through his tank hatch. Everything he believed about German superiority was cracking like thin ice. The Soviets were supposed to be primitive and backward. Their equipment should have been junk compared to German precision. But one T-34 had shattered 3 of his best tanks and escaped without a scratch. The harsh reality was just beginning to dawn on the German commanders. They had laughed at Soviet engineering without understanding it. The slanted armor of the T-34 was not crude or primitive. It was brilliant. And there were thousands more of these tanks waiting for them deeper in Russia. Intelligence reports flooded German headquarters like water through a broken dam. Radio messages crackled in from every sector of the Eastern Front. Tank commanders reported the same impossible story over and over. Soviet tanks with slanted armor were appearing everywhere. They could not be destroyed by normal German weapons. Muller sat in his command tent, reading report after report. His coffee had grown cold hours ago. Maps covered his desk, marked with red crosses where German tanks had been lost. Each cross represented good men and expensive machines. The pattern was clear and terrifying. Wherever these T-34 tanks appeared, German forces retreated. A captured T-34 arrived at the German testing facility on a railroad car. Engineers swarmed over it like ants on honey. They measured every inch of armor with precise tools. The front plate was only 45 millimeters thick, but it slanted back at 60 degrees. This simple angle made it as strong as 90 millimeters of straight armor. German engineers had never thought of this trick. Major Hans Kruger ran his hands along the slanted armor. The steel felt rough under his fingers. It was not polished like German armor, but mathematics did not care about polish. The angle turned glancing blows into harmless ricochets. Every German shell would slide off like water off a roof. The T-34's gun was another shock. The 70 cb6mm cannon was much bigger than anything on German tanks. It fired shells that could punch through German armor at incredible distances. The turret was welded instead of bolted. This made it stronger, but harder to repair. Soviet engineers had chosen strength over convenience. Inside the captured tank, German officers found evidence of mass production. Part numbers were stamped, not engraved. Welds were functional, but not pretty. Everything was built for war, not for show. The driver's seat was uncomfortable. The viewing ports were small and dirty. But the tank worked perfectly for killing German panzers. Intelligence officers brought disturbing news from captured Soviet factories. Photographs showed assembly lines stretching as far as the eye could see. Hundreds of T-34 hulls moved down conveyor belts. Workers welded armor plates with speed and skill. The Soviets were building 12,000 T-34s every year. Germany could barely make 1,000 tanks of all types. Kruger studied the factory photos with growing dread. German tank factories were workshops where craftsmen built each tank by hand. Every part was perfect, but production was slow. Soviet factories were like rivers of steel. The tanks might not be as pretty, but there were so many more of them. Quantity was becoming its own kind of quality. Reports came in of German shells bouncing off T-34s at point-blank range. Tank crews described the horrible sound of their shots ricocheting away. The ping of metal on metal meant death was coming. Soviet tanks could destroy German panzers from distances where German guns were useless. Muller witnessed this horror firsthand during a battle near Bryansk. His Panzer IV faced a T-34 across an open field. The distance was 400 meters. Muller's gunner fired first. The shell hit the T-34's front armor and bounced high into the air. The Soviet tank did not even slow down. The T-34's return shot punched through Muller's side armor like paper. Hot metal fragments filled the fighting compartment. Muller's radio operator screamed as shrapnel tore into his leg. Smoke and flames forced the crew to abandon their tank. Muller watched his perfect German machine burn, while the T-34 drove away unharmed. German tank crews began refusing orders to attack T-34s directly. They had learned that frontal attacks were suicide. Some crews painted extra armor plates on their tanks, but it was never thick enough. Others tried to attack from the sides or rear, but T-34s were fast and hard to catch. Field reports described the industrial efficiency behind Soviet tank production. T-34s were designed to be repaired by farmers with hammers. Parts were interchangeable between different tanks. Soviet crews could cannibalize damaged tanks to keep others running. German tanks needed factory-trained mechanics and special tools for simple repairs. The contrast became clear during winter fighting. German tanks broke down in the cold. Their complex transmissions froze. Precision parts cracked in the bitter temperatures. T-34s kept running because they were built simple and strong. Wide tracks spread their weight over soft ground. German tanks with narrow tracks sank into mud and snow. Captured Soviet tank manuals revealed the thinking behind T-34 design. Soviet engineers had studied German tanks and found their weaknesses. They built their own tanks to fight a long war, not win quick battles. Every design choice favored reliability over complexity. Function mattered more than form. The psychological effect on German crews was devastating. Tank commanders who had felt invincible now feared every battle. The sound of T-34 engines made veteran soldiers nervous. Some crews claimed they could tell the difference between German and Soviet tank engines just by listening. The T-34's diesel engine had a deeper, more threatening rumble than German gasoline engines. German propaganda tried to hide the truth, but tank crews knew better. They whispered about the T-34 in mess halls and bunkers. Some called it the ghost tank, because it appeared suddenly and disappeared just as fast. Others named it the Devil's Chariot, because it seemed impossible to kill. Intelligence estimates grew more frightening each week. The Soviets had thousands of T-34s ready for battle. German forces faced an endless stream of these deadly machines. Every destroyed T-34 was replaced by 3 more from the factories. German tank losses could not be replaced as quickly. Muller stared at aerial photographs of Soviet tank columns. Hundreds of T-34s moved toward the front like a steel river. Their slanted armor gleamed in the sunlight. Each one was a mathematical puzzle that German gunners could not solve. The harsh reality was becoming impossible to ignore. Soviet engineering had outthought German pride, and the price would be paid in blood. The morning mist hung over the Kursk salient like a gray blanket in July 1943. Muller sat in his command bunker reading intelligence reports that made his blood run cold. Soviet forces had assembled 5,000 T-34 tanks for the defense of Kursk. 5,000. The number seemed impossible, but German reconnaissance confirmed it again and again. Photographs showed endless rows of slanted armor gleaming in the early sunlight. Muller's hands trembled as he turned the pages. 2 years of fighting had aged him beyond his years. Gray streaks marked his hair where none had been before. His uniform hung loose on his thin frame. The confident tank commander who had rolled into Russia was gone, replaced by a man who understood the mathematics of defeat. A wooden crate arrived at headquarters that morning. Inside lay a captured T-34 factory manual, translated into German by intelligence officers. The pages were rough and yellowed, but the information they contained would shatter everything Muller believed about warfare. He opened the manual and began to read by lamplight. The Soviet engineers had not stumbled onto slanted armor by accident. They had calculated every angle with precise mathematics. The 60-degree slope doubled the effective thickness of steel without adding weight. German engineers had never considered this simple geometric truth. They had built their tanks like medieval castles, with straight walls that wasted metal and offered no protection advantage. Muller read deeper into the manual and discovered more shocking truths. Soviet factories did not waste time on perfect welds or polished surfaces. Every design choice served a single purpose: killing German tanks. The T-34's wide tracks distributed weight over soft ground. Its simple transmission could be repaired by mechanics with basic tools. The powerful diesel engine ran on cheaper fuel and caught fire less often than German gasoline engines. The manual described production methods that seemed impossible to German thinking. Soviet workers built T-34s on assembly lines that never stopped moving. Each tank took only half the time to build compared to a German panzer. Quality control meant the tank had to shoot straight and move forward. Everything else was unnecessary decoration. Muller closed his eyes and tried to imagine Soviet factories during the long Russian winter. Workers in thick coats welding armor plates by the thousands. Steam rising from hot metal in freezing air. Assembly lines that ran day and night, feeding an endless hunger for tanks. While German factories focused on making perfect machines, Soviet factories focused on making enough machines to win. The realization hit Muller like a physical blow to his stomach. German engineers had been playing the wrong game entirely. They built tanks to impress generals and engineers. Soviets built tanks to destroy enemies. German tanks were mechanical artwork. Soviet tanks were weapons of war. The difference had cost Germany the Eastern Front. He thought about his first encounter with a T-34 near Smolensk 2 years earlier. The crude-looking tank that had destroyed 3 of his panzers. At the time, he had called it lucky. Now he understood it had been inevitable. Soviet engineers had studied German tanks and built better ones. They had solved problems German engineers never knew existed. The manual explained the T-34's slanted armor in simple terms that made Muller feel foolish. When a shell hit straight armor, all its energy went into penetration. When the same shell hit slanted armor, much of its energy was deflected away. The remaining energy had to penetrate much more steel because of the angle. Basic physics had defeated German engineering pride. Mueller picked up his field telephone and called the tank repair depot. He needed to see a T-34 with his own eyes to understand what Soviet engineers had really built. 20 minutes later, he stood beside a captured T-34 in a maintenance shed. The tank looked rough and unfinished compared to German machines. Paint was uneven. Welds were functional but ugly. Yet this crude machine had killed more German tanks than any other weapon. He climbed inside the T-34's fighting compartment. The space was cramped and uncomfortable. German tanks had more room and better equipment. But comfort did not matter when shells were flying. The T-34's thick, slanted armor kept its crew alive, while German crews died in their more comfortable tanks. The T-34's gun breech was simple and strong. German tank guns were more precise, but precision meant nothing if the tank was dead before it could shoot. The Soviet 76mm cannon could destroy German tanks at ranges where German guns were useless. Bigger bullets won gunfights, regardless of how accurately they were made. Muller ran his hand along the T-34's internal armor. His fingers found rough spots and tool marks that German inspectors would never have allowed. But the armor was thick and well-angled. It had kept this tank's crew alive through dozens of battles. Beauty contests did not matter in war. Outside the shed, Mueller stared at the sky and tried to accept the truth. German engineers had built tanks for peacetime parades and engineering competitions. Soviet engineers had built tanks for the largest war in human history. The Soviets understood that good enough, built in large numbers, would always defeat perfect, built in small numbers. His thoughts turned to German propaganda about Slavic inferiority and primitive Soviet technology. The T-34 proved those ideas were deadly lies. Soviet engineers were not primitive. They were practical. They did not build tanks to impress anyone. They built them to win wars. The slanted armor was not an accident or lucky discovery. It was brilliant engineering that German pride had been too blind to see. Mueller felt something break inside his chest, like a rope snapping under too much weight. Everything he had believed about German superiority was wrong. The master race had been out-engineered by people they called inferior. The perfect German war machine was losing to Soviet practicality and Soviet numbers. That night, Mueller sat in his bunker and wrote in his diary by candlelight. His words would never be seen by German censors or propaganda ministers. They were too dangerous and too true. He wrote that the T-34 had not just defeated German tanks, it had shattered German illusions about superiority itself. The train wheels clicked against cold steel rails as Mueller stared through dirty windows at the German countryside in March 1946. Bare trees reached toward gray skies like broken fingers. Bombed cities passed by in ruins. Factory smokestacks stood silent and cold. The proud German war machine had become twisted metal and broken concrete. Mueller wore the rough clothes of a released prisoner. His uniform burned long ago in a Soviet camp. His hands were different now. Thick calluses covered his palms from 2 years of working in Soviet tank repair facilities. He had learned to weld armor plates and rebuild transmissions with basic tools. The same hands that once commanded perfect German panzers had fixed hundreds of T-34s for their Soviet captors. Every day, he touched the slanted armor that had defeated his armies. The Soviet tank repair facility had been a harsh teacher. Endless rows of damaged T-34s arrived from battlefields across Eastern Europe. Mueller and other German prisoners worked 12 hours each day fixing them. They welded new armor plates over battle damage. They installed new engines and transmissions. They painted fresh numbers on turrets and sent the tanks back to war. Working inside Soviet factories had shown Mueller the true scale of their industrial power. The repair facility was just one small part of a system that stretched across 11 time zones. Assembly lines that built tanks faster than Germany could destroy them. Foundries that melted scrap metal into new armor plates. Workers who understood that speed mattered more than perfection in total war. Mueller had watched Soviet engineers solve problems with simple solutions that German engineers would have made complex. When T-34 transmissions failed, Soviet mechanics replaced them with improved versions in hours. When armor cracked, they welded patches that were stronger than the original steel. Everything was designed to be fixed quickly by workers with basic skills. The contrast with German methods had been painful to witness. German tanks required factory-trained specialists and precision tools for simple repairs. A broken transmission meant weeks in a repair depot. Soviet tanks could be fixed by farm boys with hammers and welding torches. The mathematics of maintenance had been as important as the mathematics of armor angles. His train pulled into Munich station with a screech of brakes and hiss of steam. Mueller stepped onto the platform carrying a small cloth bag that held everything he owned. The station was crowded with other returning prisoners, their faces marked by years of captivity and hard labor. They moved like ghosts through the ruins of their former lives. The city shocked him more than Soviet prison camps had. Munich looked like a mouth with most of its teeth knocked out. Allied bombing had left gaps between buildings like missing teeth. Rubble filled the streets. Children played in the ruins of what had once been proud German architecture. The master race lived in cellars and ate from garbage cans. Mueller walked through streets he had known since childhood. The brewery where his father had worked was gone, replaced by a crater filled with rainwater. The school where he had learned about German superiority was a pile of broken bricks. The tank factory that had built his first panzer was twisted metal under open sky. His family's apartment building still stood, though windows were boarded with wood and cloth. His wife Anna answered the door after long minutes of knocking. She looked older, thinner, with gray hair where brown had been. Her dress was patched and mended many times. She stared at him as if seeing a ghost from another world. Anna had survived by trading family possessions for food. Mueller's medals and trophies had bought bread during the hungry winter of 1945. His dress uniforms had been torn up for children's clothes. His technical manuals had been burned for heat. Everything that represented German military pride had been consumed by the simple need to stay alive. Over dinner of thin soup and black bread, Anna told him about the final days of the war. Soviet tanks had rolled through Munich streets like steel rivers, the same T-34s that Mueller had learned to repair in captivity. German resistance had melted away like snow in spring. The tanks that had defeated the Wehrmacht had occupied the homeland without firing a shot. Mueller described his time in Soviet captivity, but he could not explain what he had really learned. How could he tell his wife that German engineering had been wrong about everything important? How could he admit that Soviet prisoners had taught him more about practical design than German technical schools? The truth was too bitter for words. He visited the ruins of the technical college where he had studied engineering before the war. The library was gone, its books scattered by wind and rain. The laboratory where students had admired German precision was open to the sky. Weeds grew through cracks in the concrete, where professors had once lectured about German superiority. Standing in the ruins, Muller remembered his first engineering classes. Professors had taught that German methods were naturally superior to primitive foreign designs. Precision and complexity were always better than simple functionality. The master race would naturally build better machines than inferior peoples. Every lesson had been a lie that led to military disaster. Muller found work in a factory that repaired American trucks for the occupation forces. The vehicles were simple and robust, built for mass production rather than engineering elegance. They reminded him of T-34 tanks in their practical design philosophy. Function mattered more than form. Reliability trumped precision. Good enough, built in large numbers, defeated perfect, built in small quantities. Years passed, and Muller never spoke publicly about his realizations. German society was not ready to hear that their enemies had been better engineers. Pride was one of the few things Germans had left after losing everything else. But he knew the truth, and it shaped everything he taught young engineers who came to work at the factory. The T-34's influence spread far beyond the battlefields where it had destroyed German tanks. Every modern tank used slanted armor because Soviet engineers had proven its effectiveness. NATO tanks, Warsaw Pact tanks, tanks built decades later in countries that had not existed during World War II. All carried the mathematical legacy of that crude-looking machine that had first appeared near Smolensk. On quiet evenings, Muller would sit by his window and watch the sunset paint the sky red above Munich's rebuilt streets. He thought about the T-34s he had repaired in Soviet captivity, and the lesson they had taught him about engineering and warfare. The slanted armor had not just defeated German tanks. It had shattered the illusion that technical superiority belonged to any single nation or people. Innovation came from necessity, not from claims of racial supremacy. The harsh reality had been written in steel and mathematics. Soviet engineers had outthought their German counterparts by focusing on what mattered most. The T-34 proved that effective design would always defeat prestigious design in the mathematics of war.